Can you all see the introduction slide? Yeah?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, great. In fact, you might even be able to make it as the largest screen or the largest image on your computer screen or your iPad or your iPhone. Okay, this is actually a painting that's in the exhibition. It's a portrait of Andy Warhol. He made his last body of work, or his last portraits in 1986, right before he died in February of 1987. It's an image I really love because Andy Warhol is a figure of transformation, and a lot of people know him as having these outrageous white wigs, having an entourage of superstars and celebrities around him. But by the time he died, he was already, well known, well recognized. He was part of the established art world in a lot of museum collections. He was sought after for merchandising, for commercials, for all sorts of things. You probably saw that Burger King commercial maybe a couple years ago, but that was Warhol had a very strong presence before he passed. And so I really love this body of work, these portraits, because they really show this very mystical looking Warhol. And so I wanted to start with that, but really talk about the beginnings of Andy Warhol, sort of his roots. A lot of people think of Andy as a New Yorker, which is it's pretty much true. Andy was born in 1928, child of the Depression, but he was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so he didn't move to New York City until after he graduated college. And so a lot of people never realized that Andy Warhol grew up in an ethnic neighborhood here in Pittsburgh. His family, the Warhola family, I should say, so we know him as Andy Warhol, but the Warhola family, they're Carpatho-Rusyn. And the Carpatho-Rusyn people, they're people without a homeland. And so the Warhola family's from a small town called Makova, which is in modern day Slovakia by the border of Poland. There's just a little map here, and I've got some family photos. The gentleman on the bottom right is Andy Warhol's father, Andrei Warhola, and then the images on the image on the bottom left is Andy in the middle and his two brothers, John and Paul. Andy was the baby of three boys. Andy's father was a laborer. He worked in factories and coal mines. He worked for a company that helped move houses and move buildings prior to the Depression. Andy's father actually married his mother, Julia Warhola, in Makova, but then ended up coming to the United States and settling here in Pittsburgh. And so the Warhola roots really took place here in Pittsburgh in a neighborhood known as the Ruska Dolina. And that's also known as the Rusyn Valley. But we have one of the largest concentrations of Carpatho-Rusyn people in the United States. So it's something that's still has a very strong heritage and presence here in Pittsburgh. These are images of probably, I think, the most important woman in Warhol's life. This is his mother, Julia Warhola. She's very well represented in Revelation. And Julia Warhola is sort of an unsung hero. No one ever thinks about her when they think about Andy Warhol, but they certainly will after they see Revelation. And so the photo on the left is Julia, and Andy's the baby on the right side of her lap. And then the photo on the right is actually in the exhibition. It's like one of those photo booth images, and that's just so typical of Andy Warhol. He would go on to make portraiture, and first using photos that were based off photo shoots that took place in photo booths. We have a couple in our museum that people can use, so they're really a fun way to do early selfies. Oh, I can be sure to put yourselves on mute. I can hear some people talking. Sorry. So Julia Warhola was a very pious woman. She was religious. She worked cleaning houses. The whole family sort of was working class. Well, they were actually poor. They lived in a very poor neighborhood, but they did what they could to make ends meet. And Julia, not only was she a religious woman, the family was a Byzantine Catholic, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But Julia also really cultivated religion, but she also cultivated Andy's artistic side. She was a self-taught artist, and so she didn't go to college. She just sort of repetitively doodled, and she doodled her two favorite subjects, angels and cats. And so we've got dozens and dozens of drawings in our collection. A lot of them aren't just scraps of paper, and they're of angels and they're of cats, and they all tend to look the same. But it's so beautiful to see sort of her wild penmanship throughout these drawings, but also in Andy's work, which I'll touch upon in a few minutes. But Julia, she never signed her name Julia Warhol. She always signed her name as Andy Warhol's mother. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But Revelation will have a strong representation display of Julia and her early drawings. This is a photo. This is actually borrowed. This is not in the exhibition, but it's borrowed from the Heinz History Center. This is the Ruska Dolina. Today it's called Greenfield. Pittsburgh is the city of bridges. Pittsburgh is very industrial. We have, I believe, more bridges than Venice. I think it has a lot of commonalities with Louisville, and it has 3 rivers. And this neighborhood, this is an image from, I think, the 1940s, around the same time that Andy was growing up in the Ruska Dolina. And so this is in Pittsburgh. You can see sort of the mounds, the hills. You can see the railroad tracks. It's a very industrial city. And if you look carefully on your screen in the upper right, there's the tallest building in the Ruska Dolina. It's got sort of 2 onion domes on top. Pittsburgh has tons of churches. Pittsburgh has lots of ethnic neighborhoods. So the presence of immigration is really strong here. We have neighborhoods that still bear those names, like Little Italy, Deutschtown, Polish Hill. And so in the Ruska Dolina, the center of this neighborhood would have been the church. And so I pointed out the tallest building with the 2 domes in the back. That's St. John Chrysostom. That's the family church that the Warhols would have gone to, and all of the Carpatho-Rusin people in the community would have gone to. This would have been the center of the neighborhood. There also at the time would have been shops. There would have been social life around the church, which would have included the Warhol family going more than once a week, which is, I guess, more typical for modern day Catholics. This is the interior of the church. It's the oldest and only known image of the interior of the church. This is, we believe, maybe pre-1950s. But inside the church, St. John Chrysostom, you walk inside, and you can still visit it today. So if you were to come to Pittsburgh and maybe make a pilgrimage to visit Andy Warhol's gravesite or the museum, you could actually enter St. John Chrysostom. And what makes Byzantine Catholicism so distinct is the icon panel, or the iconostasis. So you can see this icon panel here, and the people sort of facing it. And so in the Byzantine Catholic tradition, the iconostasis is the focal point of the church. And you'll see that you see different images, which are the icon paintings. Icons don't necessarily need to be paintings, but they're representations of different saints. Jesus is there. In the very top center, it's hard to see, but there's actually a painting of the Last Supper, which is an image, a motif that Warhol covers in his work later in his life. You can see Jesus, you can see the Virgin Mary. And so a lot of people attribute the iconostasis as sort of being an introduction to Warhol's use of gold leaf, an introduction of repetition, of seriality. Warhol would have gone to several different Byzantine Catholic churches, but there's a very distinct sort of distinct guidelines on where the prophets and where the apostles are placed within the iconostasis panel. I believe there's an image of this in the exhibition, and it's also published in the catalog. It's never been published before. The church has been very helpful with the exhibition. And just so you know, St. John Chrysostom, the Warhol family still goes there to worship. They're still around, the descendants of Andy Warhol. They're here, and they all helped us with the exhibition. And so this particular image has never been published before, only until our catalog for the show. So Andy as a kid, it's funny how the iconostasis actually looks like this Hollywood scrapbook. I noticed that last night when I made this. The collection, the Andy Warhol Museum, we not only have Andy's artwork, we have a lot of his personal stuff, which is really incredible. And so as a child, Warhol was the youngest of 3 boys. He had lots of health issues. He had very pale skin. He had an illness known as St. Vitus stance, which often kept him bedridden at home. So when he was at home, his mother, Julia, not only cultivated his art, but the family would help him write to movie stars. He was really fascinated. His mother actually would clean houses, and she actually saved up enough to buy him a camera, a projector. And so they would screen films, cartoons at home. They would go to the cinemas here. Pittsburgh was very industrial and grim, but it was also a very cosmopolitan city in its day. And so Andy also got, he got introductions to popular culture through Hollywood stars. And of course, this reappears throughout his whole career. And so I just wanted to show you this. You might recognize some stars. Like I can only recognize Carmen Miranda and Mae West on this particular scrapbook. We have many scrapbooks in Warhol's collection, in Warhol's archives here. But just to give you an example, this is one of the most prized treasures. of the Warhol Museum. It's an autograph from Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple was actually born the same year as Andy Warhol, 1928. I like to think of it as the first Hollywood blonde that Warhol sort of gravitated towards. But Warhol saved everything. Some people think he was a collector, a connoisseur. Some people think he was a hoarder. But in our collection, we also have the archives, which consist of a lot of the ephemera and the personal effects of Warhol's career. But to have something so treasured that Warhol saved through his life is so meaningful. So it's really interesting to see that we would have his scrapbooks, but also the personalized images of Hollywood celebrities. We don't do this today, but it's incredible to see that Warhol was already communicating with the Hollywood stars, even as a child. Andy's father died when he was about 13 years old. And when he died, he actually left a bond for Andy to go to college. Andy would be the first person in his family to go to college. This is a big deal. So Andy actually went to Holmes Elementary School. The school doesn't exist anymore, but we know where it was. And he went to Shenley High School. And this is an image from his high school yearbook. And so we have the yearbook in our collection, and it's very interesting because at the bottom of the image, it's actually a very small image. It actually has a quote. It says his name, and it has a quote, and it says as genuine as a fingerprint. And so that already sort of showed the quirkiness, the artistic side of him. He was a strange guy. He graduated Shenley High School and would go on to Carnegie Tech. Carnegie Tech is Carnegie Mellon University. It still exists today. And through his father's passing and through this bond, he would go to college to study pictorial design. This is another historical photo that we borrowed. This is on loan to us from the Heinz History Center here in Pittsburgh. What you're seeing in the middle is, and I don't know if any of you have been to Pittsburgh, but this is a very interesting photo. You've got this very tall building. It's the Cathedral of Learning. It's not a religious building, but it looks like this sort of Gothic style, sort of monumental building. It's part of the University of Pittsburgh, and it's famous for its international classrooms. I believe when it was being built, different countries would sponsor the rooms. So I think they're called the nationality rooms. You can also see at the middle left-ish area, that's the Carnegie Museum of Art, or would have been the Carnegie Museum of Art and Natural History. And in the upper left, past that foresty-looking area, that would have been the Ruska Dolina. So if you look around the Cathedral of Learning, and there's also a baseball field that no longer exists. But this was Warhol's neighborhood. He would have, and this is my neighborhood too, because Pittsburgh's not a very big city. But in the background, you can see, even in the upper right, you can see the Monongahela River. So you can see the furnaces, you can see the smokestacks. Pittsburgh was regarded as one of the most polluted cities. It obviously has a lot of industry with coal and steel. During World War II, it was the second largest producer of aluminum and steel towards the war effort. So it was a very important city in the United States, and Andy would have been a part of this. The city was very polluted. It was very poverty-stricken, but it was also very cosmopolitan, just not far from this neighborhood by Warhol's College. He was also had access to downtown Pittsburgh. As a child, Warhol would go to the Carnegie Museum of Art and take art classes. The upper-level patrons would support what was called the Tam O'Shanter drawing sessions, and Andy was one of thousands who would go there and drawing classes. Warhol also, as a college student, had access to the Carnegie Museum of Art. He would go to art galleries, to the cinemas. So we know that he was very interested in the arts and sort of artistic culture. And so anyways, the Cathedral of Learning during Warhol's time in high school and college would have been the second tallest building in Pittsburgh. So it just shows you sort of this sort of booming town that Andy would have been a part of. He had never been anywhere else until he eventually would go to New York City. This is a photo of Andy moving in New York City. In 1949, Andy Warhol graduates Carnegie Tech. He got a degree in pictorial design. And he moved to New York City with his friend, Philip Pearlstein. Philip Pearlstein's also a very important artist. In fact, I think he's still alive. He might be 92, 93 years old. But Philip Pearlstein's another successful artist who left Pittsburgh. But Philip Pearlstein and Andy studied college together at Carnegie Tech. And they moved together to New York City. And so within a week, Andy actually found work immediately as a commercial illustrator. And so there's a strong decade of work that a lot of people are not familiar with that is well represented here at the museum and is also represented in Andy Warhol Revelation. Andy Warhol had a particular style during this period. We like to call it pre-pop. Um, Andy was known for doing drawings that were made in what we call the blotted line technique. The blotted line technique was a technique that was basically a printmaking style, a printmaking method, where you would take a tracing, drawing on a tracing paper, and then tape it to a sheet of paper, and then basically fold the paper back and forth with ink. So you'd create this sort of smushed sort of image. Warhol, during the 1950s, he got his first commission with Glamour magazine and would go on to work for a lot of advertising agencies, a lot of magazines. He was known in the 50s as the Leonardo da Vinci of shoes. He had a very long campaign with I. Miller Shoes. I. Miller Shoes was one of his most important patrons at the time. He also did work for Cadillac, Lord & Taylor, Tiffany's, Mademoiselle, Harper's Bazaar. And it was during a period of time where a lot of advertising really relied on illustration. And a lot of people didn't know how Warhol did his blotted line technique. And this is just one example of the types of commercial work that he would do. And here's an example of just what an ad would look like in the New York Times. I. Miller Shoes would often take full page ads in the New York Times Sunday issue, like the wedding section. And Warhol originally started illustrating real shoes of the season. And eventually they liked his work so much that he would actually just invent shoes that weren't necessarily available through I. Miller Shoes. And eventually he would start signing his name and then of course transforming himself into Andy Warhol. This is a photo in our collection by Dwayne Michaels. Dwayne Michaels, also from Pittsburgh, a very famous photographer. And I love it because two years after Warhol moves to New York City, Julia follows. His mother, her boys are all grown up. She's home in Pittsburgh, widowed. So she moves in with Andy and never leaves. She lives with Andy for about 20 years. You can see Andy in the background smiling. You rarely see images of Andy Warhol smiling. So I think it's a real rare treat to see this. Julia, she spoke very broken English. She helped Andy cook. She cooked and cleaned and helped Andy around the house. But he also put her to work in other ways. You know, I mentioned she was a self-taught artist. And during the 1950s and early 60s, Julia is actually responsible for all the penmanship you see in the Warhol work of the 50s and 60s. This is fitting for this session. This was a horoscopes for the cocktail hour. This was a cocktail recipe book that Warhol created. During the 50s, he did a lot of self-published books. These were books he would make for friends. He would sign them, dedicate them to clients, hoping that they would remember him. This has a beautiful stamping technique. I know with Warhol, we talk about repetition, seriality, but even before the silkscreen process, you can see that he's used a stamping technique to sort of create repetition. But the more important thing is that the handwriting, the scripture that says horoscopes for the cocktail hour, that's actually Julia's handwriting. Her handwriting had sort of this childish, naive penmanship. There was often typos. Warhol embraced that, and she actually won an award for her, a graphic design award for her penmanship. During the 1950s, Warhol took on lots of clients, and this is just an example of sort of the combination of sort of accessories, fashion, but Warhol also did things based off the holidays. Warhol loved the holidays. He loved Christmas. Later in his life, in New York City, he would go to soup kitchens on Easter and Christmas and feed the homeless. And on the right-hand side, that's actually a blotted line drawing with gold leaf. It's in the exhibition, and it's a nativity scene. It's not that Warhol would have done this out of the need to represent his religion. A client would have asked him. This was for Tiffany's like holiday greeting card design, and he would have shown. He obviously was well versed and familiar with the subject matter. This is something that's quite interesting. Andy did a lot of self-made books, but he and his mother made a book together called 25 Cats Named Sam and One Blue Pussy. And so it's said that they lived with up to 25 Siamese cats. And I think that myth has been debunked, but they did indeed live with many cats named Sam. And there supposedly was one named Hester, which is in the book. And this is Andy's illustrations, but these are that's her penmanship. Warhol was so successful in the 1950s as a commercial illustrator that he was making about $60,000 a year. He treated himself in 1956 with a trip around the world. This was the first time he ever left the United States. He went to Hawaii. He went to Japan. This is from Tokyo. he went to Egypt, he went to Rome, he went to Ireland and England, and then he came back. And so that's him on the second person on the right-hand side. He also tried to exhibit his blotted line shoes in 1956 at the Museum of Modern Art. And he actually was admitted into a group exhibition. It was sort of an open call, and he had submitted a blotted line illustration, and he had offered the museum to take it as a donation for the permanent collection. And so he received a rejection letter that they didn't want it. So we actually have the rejection letter in our collection. It says, "Dear Mr. Warhol, blah, blah, blah. I regret that I must report to you that the committee decided after careful consideration that they ought not to accept it for our collection. The drawing may be picked up from the museum at your convenience." So it just kind of shows you what a blow it was for Warhol to cross over from the commercial world into the world of pop. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move a little bit quicker. But Warhol's really interesting because he crosses over into the fine art world at an interesting time when the abstract expressionists were sort of the dominant artists in the United States. If you think of Jackson Pollock, artists sort of representing their emotions with action on canvas. And so this is some of the earliest Campbell soup can paintings. This is one of them in our collection. But I love this because you can see sort of the fusion between pop and abstraction. And it's a very large painting that you can see, but Warhol would go on to perfect a very stylized, machine-made looking work, which of course this looks, it almost even looks like an advertisement for Campbell soup. Warhol would go on and develop the silkscreen process. The silkscreen process was something that was already being used in newspapers. It was not a process that was considered fine art. Andy took on this method. He would take images, appropriate the images, as we say in the art world, and turn them into screens, and then the screens could be filled with ink and then squeegeed onto canvas. Warhol had a gift of selecting sort of subject matter that was well recognized. This is Elvis. Warhol did a whole body of work of Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, the Mona Lisa. And it's really incredible because when you think of something like Elvis, we see it in a nostalgic way, but this would have been like putting Taylor Swift on canvas. This would have been outrageous. This would have pissed people off. And so I think Warhol was really responding to the transformation of American culture, but also shifting sort of the way the art world had been established. You know, the art world of that time would have been for a very elite audience, well-educated, wealthy. And then people all of a sudden start seeing this type of work and like, oh, I just saw that on TV. And so I, of course, love the Jackie paintings. We have them in Revelation, Jackie in Mourning. But a lot of people don't know that Warhol would have been, he thought a lot about the source material in his work. And for the Jackie paintings, they're based off 8 source photos, but they all revolve around the assassination of JFK. This would have been one of those where were you at type moments in your life. And I think it's incredible that Warhol would have chosen something like the death of JFK and then address it not through JFK himself, but through Jackie Kennedy, who was a very adored first lady. Warhol would also go on to depict death and disaster in America. These were quite shocking when they were made in 1963. They would go on to be exhibited in Paris, not in the US, for the first time. And these were made from appropriated images of suicides, of electric chairs, of car crashes. And these were seen so grim and grisly. And a lot of people think pop is whimsical and joyful, but I think it's important to understand that pop reflects everyday culture, and that can also be something that's not as cheerful as flowers or soup cans. Warhol would go on to move in the early 60s into his most famous studio, the Silver Factory. This is just a photo in our collection. The factory itself was covered in foil. It was a space to make art and very much in mass production, but it was also a place to socialize. It was a place to see and be seen, and Warhol was sort of responding to that, sort of, as I mentioned, evolving into the Warhol that we know today. You can see he's got glasses here. He'll eventually change his own style and look throughout the decades. But this was a very important space in Warhol's career. Probably would have been the most creative and chaotic space probably in the country during the early 60s. Warhol surrounded himself with an entourage of sort of wannabe celebrities, and he called them superstars. The superstars were often ordained with new names. And so here we've got just sort of a collection of people that were around Warhol. You see Nico. Nico was part of the Velvet Underground. I don't see Edie Sedgwick here, but she's also probably the most well-known one. And you see Warhol sort of hidden on the far left. Warhol would go on to experiment with avant-garde filmmaking. A lot of people think of his durational films, like an 8-hour film of the Empire State Building, a 6-hour film of someone sleeping. He would go on to make a film of Robert Indiana eating a mushroom. And so the films were shocking. People thought some of them were pornographic. But Warhol, at some point in his career, he said he abandoned painting and would become a filmmaker. And so he would go on to cast his array of superstars in films. This is just a screen grab of a film called Poor Little Rich Girl, which features Edie Sedgwick, his most famous superstar. And Poor Little Rich Girl is also a film that Shirley Temple had starred in as a child. I thought it was very interesting. Revelation has a film that Warhol was commissioned to make in 1967, and it was funded by the Catholic Church. We refer to it as Sunset, and it's a film. It was a film commission for a religious pavilion in the San Antonio World's Fair called the Hemisphere in 1968. Warhol eventually abandoned the project, but he spent a whole summer in '67 filming sunsets from New York City all the way to California. And so Warhol thought that a sunset would be the best sort of contemporary, methodical sort of work for this pavilion. The pavilion itself was meant to be ecumenical, so covering sort of lots of sort of Christian beliefs, but also is being built by the same architect who at the same time was building the Rothko Chapel in Houston. And the Rothko Chapel, of course, is another sort of contemplative space with the Rothko paintings in it. In 1968, Warhol would go on to be shot. A lot of people forget that, so he kind of like died twice. Warhol was shot in '68 by an outraged, angry writer, feminist writer. Her name is Valerie Solanas. She's been sort of villainized. We're actually retelling her story when we reopen through one of our exhibitions. This is actually a Richard Avedon photo from, I think, '71, but you can see Warhol's scars. Valerie Solanas went in his studio and shot him, and she shot him twice, and the bullets had actually ricocheted and ruptured about 7 organs. Warhol would go on to wear corsets, medical corsets, for the rest of his life. By this time, he's also wearing professional wigs. He had already been wearing toupees all the way from his early New York years. But I think this just shows the vulnerability that Warhol had suffered. But also after this period, Warhol sort of ends the sort of open door policy of the Silver Factory and becomes more business oriented. In 1969, he launches Interview magazine. The magazine still exists. It's been coined the crystal ball of pop. Warhol would often promise people the cover. Sometimes he'd offer too many people the cover, but it just has an incredible way of sort of predicting who's next in popular culture. And of course, to this day, we still recognize these people, whether it's Warhol's paintings or the cover of Interview magazine. These are not Warhol paintings, but Warhol would have been involved in a lot of the content of the magazine. Through the 70s and 80s, I think Warhol really relied on his portrait commissions. A lot of people criticized him for that because he was almost seen as a court painter. The rich and famous, or even the rich, the rich and unfamous, can sign up and get a Warhol painting. They could buy many of them. And so these portraits often started off with photo shoots, elaborate photo shoots that involved camera crews, that involved several types of cameras. But the Polaroid is probably best recognized with these photo shoots. Dozens of Polaroids could result in creating just one canvas. This is one of Sylvester Stallone. We have some of these in our collection. I just picked these randomly. We have dozens of them. Dolly Parton, these are great. But Warhol would also, what makes them very special is that all the paintings, they're all the same size. They're all 40 by 40 inches. So you couldn't get a bigger one or a smaller one. You could only buy more of them. So that's why you might go to several museums and see a Mick Jagger painting, but then see another Mick Jagger painting in another museum. If the client went for their unveiling, so a client like Dolly actually never bought hers. So Warhol actually was not happy about that. But if a client would go sign up for a commission, they'd go to this studio, they would have the photo shoot, they'd come back for the unveiling, and that was their option to buy as many works as possible. Andy Warhol's mother would die in 1972. He didn't really tell anybody, he just kind of like went back to work. No one really heard about her. And eventually people realized she had passed away. She had actually passed away in Pittsburgh. She got sent back home. She had a lot of she had a lot of health problems. And she passed away here in Pittsburgh in '72, but Warhol would go on to paint her in 1974. And there was 9 portraits created in the same format. They just don't involve a glamorous photo shoot. He would have made the screens from a photograph in our collection that was made probably by someone else. And these will be seen in Revelation. Warhol would obviously, being a prolific artist, you know, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a lot of interesting work too. You think of Warhol as a very figurative artist. He also dealt in abstraction. You know, he fought so hard to go against the abstract expressionists, but he himself would dabble in abstraction. And towards the later part of his career, he'd make a series of shadow paintings based off shadows, and we have some of those in Revelation. Warhol also covered things that were representative of art history. We think of like Memento Mori, the passing of time. Warhol did a whole series of skull paintings. This one's a really nice painting that's in Revelation. And some people tend to see there's a little shadow casted by the skull. Some people think they see a baby's profile, or a baby doll profile, like a bulbous forehead, a little nose, and a little mouth. So people definitely see this as being like a painting about the passing of time. Warhol's assistant who took the photos for these silk screens, he actually told Andy that this was a portrait of the universe. It represented neither man nor woman nor child. It represented mankind. In 1980, and this is just a great picture. It's not a Warhol photo. It's a photo of Warhol. In 1980, Warhol would go on to and for the sake of time, I'm jumping around a bit, but I'm going chronologically. Warhol would go on to meet Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II was one of Warhol's subjects that he never actually made a silkscreen of. But Warhol, throughout his life, had admired popes, and we have souvenirs and things around popes in the exhibition Revelation. And the man to Warhol's left, that's Fred Hughes, that's his assistant, who went with him to meet the Pope in 1980. And so I just wanted to read a little passage from Warhol's diaries. If you're interested in Warhol, you could buy the book digitally, Andy Warhol's Diaries. But he writes, Wednesday, April 2nd, 1980, Naples to Rome. Fred and I had to leave for our private audience with the Pope by 10, so we left Naples at 7. We got our tickets, and then the driver dropped us off at the Vatican. When we saw 5,000 other people standing around waiting for the Pope too, I just knew that Graziella hadn't given us a private audience. But Fred put on airs and went up to the guards and said that we had a private audience with the Pope, and they laughed. They finally took us to our seats with the rest of the 5,000 people, and a nun screamed out, "You're Andy Warhol, can I have your autograph?" She looked like Valerie Solanas, so I got scared she'd pull a gun and shoot me. Then I had to sign 5 more autographs for 4 other nuns. And I just got so nervous at church. And then the Pope came out, and he was on a gold car. He did the rounds, and then finally he got up to give a speech against divorce in 7 languages. There was a bunch of cheerleaders saying, "Rah, rah, Pope." That took 3 hours. It was really boring. And then finally the Pope was coming our way. He shook everybody's hand, and Fred kissed his ring and got Susie's cross blessed. He asked Fred where he was from, and Fred said New York. And I was taking pictures. There were a lot of photographers around, and they shook my hand, and he shook my hand, and I said I was from New York too. I didn't kiss his hand. The people next to me were giving him a gold plate. They were from Belgium. The mobs behind us were jumping down from their seats. It was scary. Then Fred was going to take a Polaroid, but I said they'd think it was a machine gun and shoot us. So we never got a Polaroid of the Pope. As soon as Fred and I got blessed, we ran out. So I just think it's a very comical sort of situation, but had they gotten the Polaroid, I'm convinced that there'd be a portrait of Pope John Paul II in the Warhol collection. Warhol being the celebrity he was by the 70s and 80s, of course, he went to Studio 54, was surrounded by celebrities. He had shifted his sort of circle of friends, but Warhol was also for hire. I found this today because I had exhibited it last year. Warhol joined a modeling agency. This is from what they call the lookbook. You can see Warhol sort of in the middle, bottom middle. It says Andy Warhol, special bookings only. I mentioned the Burger King commercial. That was actually not a paid appearance, but Warhol by this time was appearing in commercials. He was taking paid endorsements just for himself. But a lot of this would actually pay for the artworks. Anything that could make money through Warhol Studio would often go to fund other art projects. Warhol even appeared on an episode of The Love Boat. It's available on YouTube if you want to check it out. He sort of plays himself surrounded by other superstars. And if you like The Love Boat, it's on YouTube, so you probably are at home and have time to watch it. It's very comical. And Warhol's last body of work would be the Last Supper series. This is a painting that's 25 feet long. It's a fluorescent pink. It's in Revelation. And in 1984, Alexander Iolis, a dealer, approaches Warhol to do a series based off the Last Supper. Warhol would go on to make over 100 works representing the Last Supper theme and narrative, but only 22 of them would actually be exhibited. And so we actually have the source material for this, and it's incredible that Warhol would take on a theme that's not only rooted to his childhood, but also take on a theme that's so well recognized. It's an image that's been parodied, lampooned, mimicked, copied, and Warhol sort of reinvents it himself. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, is the one who's credited for creating the most famous Last Supper painting, but it's an area of the exhibition that we cover with a lot of the source material related to the Last Supper series. Warhol would open the show of his Last Supper series in Milan, literally across the street from where the original mural's at. But he unfortunately would die a month later from a gallbladder procedure. So he was having a lot of pain. Warhol always feared death. He always feared the hospitals. He never visited anybody who was ill or needed assistance. And so when he went in for a gallbladder procedure, which today it's very simple, actually even then it was a very simple procedure. He actually died the next day. Warhol had his funeral here in Pittsburgh. So this is a press photo. It's in the exhibition. You can see it's not very star-studded. He did go on to have a star-studded memorial at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City later that year in '87. But it's interesting because when Warhol died, people realized, oh, he was Catholic. He was a Byzantine Catholic. And now people like myself and the curators at the Speed, we've researched to realize, oh yeah, this is a story that hasn't really been developed or told in an exhibition. And so I wanted to show that. And so, I'm over time, but this is my last image. This is from, I mentioned Warhol's sort of last self-portrait series. It sort of just depicts this really mystical Warhol with this veiled layer. This is from his Camouflage series. But I think there's still so much to learn about Warhol, but I wanted to give you sort of a 101, very swift chronological life of Warhol. I've left out a lot of stuff, but I wanted to leave enough that relates to the specific exhibition. So when I meet you all in person or when you come to the exhibition, a lot of this will sound like, oh yeah, I do remember that. And then you'll get to see a lot of the real objects in person. So thank you.
Jose, that was wonderful. This is Kim Spence speaking. That was fabulous. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us. If anyone has any questions for Jose, there's a chat function in Zoom, and feel free to type your questions. You can direct them to me, and I will share those with Jose. And so if anybody has one while you're typing it in, I thought maybe I'd get us started. You know, Jose, I was really struck by the photograph of Warhol showing his scars after being shot. And it makes me think of images of Christ as Man of Sorrow, this devotional image where Christ shows his wounds, the stigmata following the crucifixion, especially with the way that Warhol's holding his hands there. Do you think that was a conscious decision that he was making, that he was kind of trying to create this parallel with this devotional image?
Yeah, it's possible. There's been scholars who, I'm not sure if I believe it, but some scholars think Andy Warhol was very Christ-like. You know, he died once, he lived, he came. Actually, when Warhol was shot, he was pronounced dead on arrival to the hospital. So some people think, you know, he was surrounded by sinners. You know, he was surrounded by this entourage of, you know, ne'er-do-wells. And Warhol, you know, accepted everyone, and, you know, to a degree. But some people saw Warhol as this Christ-like figure, but I don't think that's necessarily true. But I do think maybe possibly that pose. Warhol in college was the only male member of an all-female dance club, modern dance club. And some people think that because of his interest in modern dance as a college student, he was very conscious about the way he posed. And I know that sounds odd, but Warhol really was very structured when you see him in a photograph. It's very controlled, it's very staged. So I think, Kim, I think you're onto something. And, you know, you can look at other depictions of Warhol. There's a very famous painting by Alice Neal in the Whitney's collection, and it also shows Warhol without a shirt on. Warhol was very self-conscious. He even wore pants and shirts and hats to the beach. So I think this was a level of vulnerability, and of course showing his scarification. So that would make an interesting paper, actually.
So I'm not seeing questions come through.
Kim, I have a point to make because I'm much shallower than you. So I just want to make 2 points. If anyone follows the Speed on Instagram, if you look at one of our Instagram stories today, it shares something that's very timely. It shows a version of the Last Supper as a Zoom meal. And so Christ is at the table, and all the apostles are showing up in small screens around him, because of course they can't be at the same table. But I do have one question, because Jose, I don't know if it was intentional that you realized that Andy Warhol's diary entry about meeting the Pope was exactly 40 years ago today.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
April 2nd in 1980. So I had a feeling you hadn't quite, when you said it, I thought, wait a minute.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're right. It was Wednesday, April 2nd, 1980. That's incredible. I didn't think of that. Wow. That's weird.
So Andy's somehow still here threading our lives together,
yeah.
right?
If you, I have the diaries on my iPhone, but if you buy the digital book of the diaries, it's organized by date. I think it's from 1976 till his death, because it ends because he dies. But you literally can do a search for like Sylvester Stallone or Cyndi Lauper or Basquiat or Catholics, and it'll take you to the pages. But some people like to actually open the book and look at the day. Oh, what happened this day? Yeah, like this. So strange.
And maybe, Jose, before we end, I'll ask you to unshare your screen so we can actually get back to the vision of our group here.